Aquatic ecosystems, like I said, are divided a little bit differently. We kind of divide them into zones or types. And I'll talk about those at the end of this chapter. Obviously, plants don't grow in every single aquatic habitat, so we don't define them based on the plants that are living there. It's more based on sort of, well, a number of variables that I'll get into, but depth and light availability have a lot to do with it. So we're going to first focus on terrestrial stuff, the stuff on land. Talk about those biomes. The plant life that we define the biomes based on, we sort of base this definition on the growth form of the plants, and that includes size, morphology, and phenology. Does anyone know what phenology refers to? It's a weird word. It's generally timing, so seasonal aspects of when they flower, when they grow, etc. So the growth period, fruiting and flowering, any kind of seasonal stuff like that is included generally in phenology. Plants are really good indicators of the environment because they can't move, right? They can't leave and go to a better environment. They kind of have to stay there. And thus they'll, like I said, be good indicators of what that environment is like. If they need a lot of water, they're going to be in an environment where there's a lot of rain. If they don't, they can survive without a lot of water. Then they can survive in areas that get significantly less precipitation. So that's why we use plants. They're sedentary and individuals can't move at least. There's a few important growth characteristics of plants that we can sort of categorize. Size, morphology, and phenology are these big categories. I'm going to talk about 6 different categories of plants that we'll see and deal with throughout this semester. And these have a lot to do with defining the biomes. So on the next couple slides, I'll talk about these 6 different categories, dealing with the growth characteristics of plants. The first major separation is whether a plant is woody or non-woody. So I'm going to start with the woody plants. And woody obviously just means they have wood in them. So they have bark, they have wood. The ones you guys are probably most familiar with, deciduous broadleaved trees and shrubs. So deciduous means what? Anyone? Do they keep their leaves year round around here? Yeah. No. Deciduous means they lose their leaves. So like all the trees around, not all of them, but most of the trees around here are deciduous. They lose their leaves when winter comes around. So that's deciduous. Broadleaved means they don't have needles for leaves. So pine trees would not be in this category. Again, most of the trees around here are broadleaved deciduous. So they have big expansive leaves. Hickory trees, oak trees, dogwood, those all fall into this deciduous broadleaved. You also have evergreen broadleaved. So evergreen trees stay green forever, right? They're green year round. They don't lose their leaves. We typically think of pine trees as evergreen broadleaved, or as evergreen trees, sorry. However, they have needles. That'll be the next category. Their leaves are needles. Here, we're not talking about trees that have needles as leaves. These are normal looking leaves, just like the previous category I talked about. So broad-leaved, they're broad, but they stay on. They don't lose them. Southern magnolia trees, if you've seen them, they are evergreen, broad-leaved trees. So there's magnolia trees out here. They still have their leaves on, and they're big leaves. They stay on year-round. Creosote bush, that's out west. You may not be familiar with it. Fig trees, if you have a fig tree in your yard, those are evergreen, broad-leaved. And the third grouping under woody plants would be the evergreen needle-leaved. These are the pines. So hemlock falls into that as well. All of the pine trees around here, they have needles for leaves. So they're not broad-leaved, they're needle-leaved, but they keep them year-round. You might be wondering, aren't there deciduous needle-leaf trees? There are, but they're not really around here. So there's some trees that have needles and they lose them in the wintertime, but they're not that common, so I'm not going to talk about them. This is what we'll run into most of the time. And for the most part around here, we have deciduous broadleaved and we have evergreen needle. These are not nearly as common. These do not. No, they're evergreen. Yeah, so they'll keep their leaves year round. So these are the three categories of woody plants that I want you to be familiar with. Again, they have wood. Their bark, their stems are stiff. It's like a tree or a shrub. So think tree or shrub. The next three categories will all be non-woody, or we call it herbaceous. These are typically smaller, less hardy. So non-woody, herbaceous. I also have three categories I'll talk about here. First, you have the graminoids. Generally, these are grasses. So there's technically three really similar groups of graminoids: grasses, sedges, and rushes. But they all kind of look like grasses. If you saw them out there, this is a sedge. If you saw that and you didn't know what it was, you'd think that's some kind of grass, right? They all kind of look like that. They look like grassy, grassy plants. They are not woody, right? There's no trunk to them. There's no bark. That's why they're non-woody herbaceous. You can break them in half very easily. That's a good way to think about it. And then you have this huge category, generally referred to as forbs or herbs. This includes a ton of different species. So you can include ferns in here. Ferns are, they're not grasses and they're not the third category I'm about to talk about. They kind of don't fit anywhere else. So ferns are a good example of forbs or herbs. A lot of wildflowers, so dandelion, any of the spring wildflowers that you're familiar with. These are, again, pretty low growing. So all of these are low to the ground. Most of the woody plants are going to be a little bit bigger, a little bit taller. But again, dandelions, there's no wood associated with the dandelion. That's why it's herbaceous. So forbs and herbs, kind of a catch-all that doesn't include grasses. And it doesn't include succulents. Succulents are sort of their own unique category. These are, think cactus. So a cactus is a succulent. They hold on to a ton of water. They grow in very dry areas. Jade is a common house plant. If you've ever had a jade plant, that's a succulent. If you squeeze on the leaves, they're really like spongy and squishy. That's all the water that it's holding on to. So you can see where ferns are not going to fit into either of these, right? And then dandelions also not going to fit into grasses or to succulents. So this is sort of the catch-all for the forbs and herbs categories, the catch-all for everything that's herbaceous, that's not a grass, sedge, or rush, and also not a succulent species. When we get into photosynthesis, I'll talk about succulents have their own kind of photosynthesis. They do something special. So they're they're separated out for a number of different reasons. We don't have a whole lot around here in southern Georgia. There's we have a native cactus, like a low-growing cactus that you might have seen, but I think that's the only succulent that really naturally grows around here. So with those 6 categories, I kind of want you to generally know the characteristics that I mentioned and be able to, you don't even need to name an example, just be able to describe the differences between those 6 categories. And again, we'll talk about, I'll use these terms again as we get into actually getting outside in the lab and sampling some of these plants. We'll be looking at different categories here. So you'll see these terms again. Any other questions about these? Back to the idea of biomes. There's different categorizations of biomes. This is, I think, one of the more common ones. But when we're talking about biomes, so like tropical rainforest versus temperate deciduous forest, you can graph those out based on precipitation and temperature. So on the y-axis here, it's a little bit weird. Colder temperatures are up top, so -15 down to +30, I guess, just to create this nice triangle rather than it being flipped. And then precipitation from 0 up to 500 centimeters. And you can look at the relative position of each of the major biomes with regards to how warm or cold it is and how much precipitation they get. So deserts, obviously really low on the precipitation scale. But you can have fairly cold deserts. Most of them are hot down here in the 25°C range, but there's some cold deserts as well. If it gets really, really cold, it turns into tundra. So from this, what I want you to know is generally kind of the relative positioning of these different biomes, and mostly the extremes. So I want you to be able to tell me that tropical rainforest is much warmer and wetter than, say, the tundra. Details on all of these biomes is essentially what I took out of this lecture. So I had slides with examples of all of these. I don't think it's all that critical as long as you have an idea, as long as you know these names. So I want you to know the names of the biomes and sort of their relative precipitation and temperature in relation to each other. We are in a temperate deciduous forest. I want you to know that temperate deciduous is kind of in the middle of both, right? Kind of warmish, coolish, and then right in the middle of the annual precipitation average. And then, like I said, kind of know the extremes. I'm not going to ask you temperate grassland versus, say, temperate evergreen forest, since I'm not going into a ton of detail. So know the extremes, know that we live in a temperate deciduous zone. Those are the main take homes from this graph. This next slide is really just for kind of your knowledge to see where these different biomes fall out. There are some additional ones down here that I don't have on that previous slide. Like I said, you can categorize these a little bit differently. Kind of another reason to not go into too much detail about it. But temperate deciduous, that's what we are, right? Most of the eastern US is temperate deciduous forests. Down along the coastal plain, you get into some of the temperate evergreen, where plants don't lose their leaves. Yeah, so you can look at that. You don't need to be able to map it, but this is just sort of so you know how these biomes kind of fall out across the globe. An important aspect of looking at the distribution around the globe of biomes is looking at the human footprint on these different biomes. So this map is showing the world and the human footprint. So relative, like 0% footprint to totally decimated, 100% footprint. If we look at this and you kind of have an idea of the different biomes, does it look like the biomes are all equally impacted? by humans or not? Are we impacting tropical rainforest as much as we've impacted temperate deciduous forest? Are we impacting desert as much as we're impacting, again, temperate deciduous forest? Where is it really easy to live for humans? Temperate deciduous is awesome, right? Is it easy to live in Alaska and the northern reaches of Canada? I haven't lived there, but I'm guessing no. It is not easy to grow food. So historically, when you think about human migrations, the eastern US, all of the US is fairly attractive from a human development standpoint, but the eastern US is where most of the initial European settlement happened. So we have a really heavy footprint in the eastern US, not so much in the northern reaches. Out west, it's more just a factor of humans didn't make it quite that far as quickly as the eastern US, so we have less population. Cold areas not as impacted. The Sahara Desert is really intact because it's very difficult to live there. Europe, high populations of people, very negatively impacted, and most of that's temperate deciduous forest. What's here? Like huge something. In Brazil and South America, there's a big forest. It's the Amazon rainforest. Okay. Yeah, the Amazon rainforest. There's a lot of diversity. You can grow a lot of stuff, but it's difficult to live and for a lot of different reasons because other dangerous things basically are living there as well. There's a lot of insect-borne diseases. So areas that are a lot of tropical rainforest can be difficult to survive in for humans, just like deserts. And then the interior of Australia, huge desert. So we're impacting areas that are easier generally for us to live in, right? So we've impacted temperate deciduous forest in a much more negative way, much more broad scale way than some of the other biomes. Okay. I want to talk about a couple of special categories of systems, mountains, and then I'll get into the aquatic ecosystems. So those biomes I talked about didn't really include the special aspects of mountains. They're unique. And then same with freshwater. So mountain systems, first off, they change as you go up in altitude. So the higher you climb on a mountain, the colder it gets. I think everyone's probably aware of that. So you get these developmental bands, different vegetation at different altitudes because of the difference in temperature. You don't need to know the names of the zones. Just know that you get this change in vegetation as you move up a mountain. The only really important, I guess, band or area of a mountain you need to know is called the tree line. And the tree line is basically the end point for where trees will grow. So you can move up a mountain. At the base, there's plenty of trees. As you get up to a certain point, trees can't grow any higher on a mountain. So you have trees here. This is basically the tree line. Above there, it's too cold and too harsh for these big trees to grow. That's the tree line. And you can see it really distinctly here. So you have trees down here, and then as you get up higher in elevation, you get fewer and fewer trees. So you would consider this kind of general area the tree line. Trees can't grow up here. A, there's no soil or not much soil, and B, it's just a really harsh environment. Once you get above the tree line, you kind of get into this shrubby grassland, and then eventually, if you go up high enough, just bare rock. So if tree line is kind of dependent on temperature in a large way, how is climate change potentially going to affect tree line? Any ideas there? If we're getting warmer, so we'll assume climate change in a mountain ecosystem is going to make the whole mountain system a little bit warmer. Is tree line going to move up, down, or stay the same? It'll move up, yeah. So the tree line, if it's warmer up here now, trees can grow a little bit higher up. So tree line, and I think, what's the percentage? People have done a lot of studies on this. So 52% of scientific studies have shown a significant upward movement of tree line on mountains. In the past, I assume that's like a decade. So they've shown an upward movement of the tree line because of the warming temperature. So if it's warmer higher up on the mountains, that means trees can grow a little higher. You're totally changing the ecology of the communities on that mountain in response to climate change. So that's one major change that's happening to mountains around the world. Any questions about mountains? That's basically what I want you to know for now. Mountains are really cool areas to look at because you can move just a little ways and see a totally different community. It's pretty fascinating. If you were doing that on the ground and moving up in latitude, you'd have to drive really far north or south. But on a mountain, you can just move up and down in elevation. Okay, aquatic systems. Aquatic systems are really diverse. I'm going to divide aquatic systems into first two categories, and then we'll kind of split off from there. Generally, we think of either freshwater or marine. There are some in-betweens, like estuaries. So it's not like a black and white distinction, but for the most part, you have freshwater ecosystems, lakes and rivers, lakes and rivers, or marine, which would be the ocean. Like I said, these aren't determined by plant life, like we define biomes, terrestrial biomes with plant life. Now we're looking at different abiotic characteristics. It's not just precipitation and temperature. There's a lot more involved. With freshwater, zones are divided based on a number of variables, including velocity. So is the water moving at all? How fast is it moving? That's going to determine what can live there. The depth and temperature and clarity, those are all fairly interlinked. The deeper you go, the colder it gets, the less light actually makes it down. So that's going to affect photosynthesis. And then the chemistry, obviously. So is it more acidic, more basic, more neutral? What minerals are dissolved in there? Is there a lot of calcium from limestone, etc.? There's a lot of things that can change in freshwater ecosystems. Similarly, in marine systems, we divide up different zones based on, in large part, depth and light availability. Those are obviously interlinked. Like I said, with the freshwater, the deeper you go, the less light. And then stability of the bottom substrate. So this isn't something we think about with freshwater systems as much, but if you think about the wave zone of an ocean, like along the beach, the substrate is very unstable. It's constantly moving and getting churned up, versus in deeper areas, you don't have as much wave action. So the substrate's a lot more stable. So now I'm going to divide these out. I'm going to talk about different types of freshwater ecosystems, and then different zones in the marine world. So we'll start with freshwater. First off, you have this division between, I'll show you the other one, lentic and lotic. So lentic's our first one. Lotic will be our second general category of freshwater systems. Lentic means not flowing. So it's a pond or a lake. It's stagnant water. Lodic is going to be flowing water. I'll show you that on the next slide. So a river. So in lentic systems, there's a few different zones I want you to be familiar with. You have the littoral and the limnetic. Littoral refers to the shallow area. That's where plants can generally grow near the shore. Limnetic is out further away from the shore. So littoral and limnetic, close to shore, away from shore. Benthic, this will show up in every aquatic system that I talk about. Benthic just means along the bottom. So benthic bottom. It can be shallow, it can be deep, but there's a lot of organisms that are benthic organisms. They live on the bottom of lakes, rivers, the ocean. So you'll see benthic a lot. And then you have zones based on whether light penetrates the water or doesn't. So the photic zone is the shallower area, the shallower reaches of the lake. It can be close into shore, it can be further out, but wherever light can penetrate to allow for photosynthesis. So photic, photosynthesis. The aphotic zone is below that, or profundal. That's how we divide up a lake or a pond. Okay. Lodic systems are flowing, kind of rhymes, lodic, flow. So these are rivers and streams. I don't have these divided into zones. We don't really have the same zone set up like we do in lakes. But an important distinction, and we'll get into more detail on this a little bit later, you can divide streams and rivers or categorize them based on how big they are, which basically comes down to how many tributaries feed into them. So the smallest ones, say up in the mountains, where they might start from a spring, they are really small. They're considered first order. So first order streams are like the mountain headwaters. Tiny, fairly fast flowing because they're in those higher elevations. So they're flowing down a mountain. As you get down in elevation, generally you get kind of a flattening out of the land. So if you think of South Georgia, it's pretty flat, the coastal plain. Those rivers, have a lot more tributaries coming into them. So they're bigger, they have more water. And they don't have the elevation change, so they're really slow. So they're big and slow when you get into lower elevations. When you get down here, you can get up to a 12th order. And I'll talk about how we actually calculate the order, but for now, you can go from first up in the headwaters. The Amazon River, a massive, massive river, is the biggest one, and it's a 12th order stream. So that's how we categorize lodic systems, just based on size. And then we have our freshwater wetlands. I'll talk about other wetlands that are like a mixture of salt and freshwater, but these are specifically freshwater wetlands. A wetland is defined based on a number of different characteristics. The main one, to be a wetland, it has to have emergent vegetation, so standing water and vegetation that sticks out above the water. That's emergent. If there's no water, or if there's no vegetation sticking out of the water, it's a lake or a pond, right? You have to have emergent vegetation of some kind for it to be considered a wetland. These are some common terms you might hear in reference to different kinds of wetlands. Generally, when you hear swamp, like the Okefenokee swamp, you have trees coming out of the water. So here you have standing water and then huge trees coming out. Generally, that's what people refer to as swamps. Marshes are mostly grasses. So this would be a good example of a marsh. You have standing water, emergent vegetation, but most of that is really grasses. You have a few trees, but it's not dominated by trees. Bogs and fens are kind of unique systems. They're often used interchangeably. Technically, bogs have acidic soil. Fens are more neutral or alkaline. There's some mountain bogs around here. Further south, there's pitcher plant bogs. I don't know of a lot of fens down here. I think those occur more up north. And for now, that's all you need to know about freshwater wetlands. Just kind of the basic intro. This is what defines a wetland. These are some general terms you might hear in reference to different wetlands. All right, on to marine systems. If we think of the ocean, we can kind of divide it like we do a lake. You have, first off, the photic zone. So just like in a lake, you have the reach, the kind of top layers of water where light can reach down to 200 meters. You still have the benthic, so the bottom, whether it's shallow or deep. And rather than littoral and limnetic, you have shallow ocean, and then the pelagic is the deep, deep ocean. So further out from shore is pelagic, closer in is shallow ocean, or you can call it near shore. A really cool part of a marine system is the intertidal zone. This is where sometimes when the tide is high, it covers the intertidal zone. When the tide is low, it's mostly dried out. There might be some remaining pools, but you don't have a constant influx of fresh water, fresh salt water, new water coming in. So intertidal, it's in between the tides. Sometimes it's flooded, sometimes it's relatively dry. If you've ever been to an area that has a good intertidal zone, there's all these neat pools that will develop, and really hardy organisms live there. So you can see, in order to survive, organisms have to be able to survive dry as well as flooded conditions. That's tough. If you imagine living in a dry area and then it gets flooded twice a day and then it dries out twice a day, it's a really tough area to live in. So you get a really unique fauna living in the intertidal zone. And you can find some really cool stuff if you hop around in the pools that you can't really see anywhere else. So intertidal zone, the unique marine associated system. And then estuaries are that kind of in between. So they're not totally fresh, they're not totally salt. They're sort of in between, and they occur typically at the edges of continents. An estuary is where a river joins the ocean. The salinity will change based on whether the tide is up. So if the tide's moving in, it'll bring more salt into the estuary. If the tide is low, it'll be more fresh water inundating the estuary, and it'll be fresher. So these are kind of harsh environments as well. A change in salinity can be difficult for most organisms to survive, so you get a really unique community in these estuaries. Salt marshes, really common if you've been down to like Savannah or Charleston, anywhere kind of in that low country. If you're driving anywhere near the coast, you'll go over bridges and you'll see miles, acres of salt marshes. They're generally dominated by these grasses. And depending on when you drive over them, you might see a lot of water in these channels, or it might be really dried out and just look muddy, kind of gross, depending on whether the tide is in or out. They're really, really pretty areas, but also very buggy, so lots of bugs. Mangrove forests are another example of sort of an estuary system. These are further south. So has anyone been to like a mangrove area? Yeah. Down, if you go to South Florida, there's mangroves along the coast. The Everglades have a lot of mangroves. So these are further south. They're trees that grow directly in the water. It has to be a little bit fresh, a little bit salt, so it's not, full on ocean necessarily, although they can handle that somewhat. And they're really salt tolerant, obviously. So on their leaves, they'll actually extrude salt. So they'll take in a lot of salt from the salt water, and then in order to rebalance their salt content, they actually basically spit out salt onto their leaves, and you can see the salt on the leaves. Very cool, unique systems. Questions so far? Hopefully I'm not going way too fast. What's that? Yeah, so the tide will affect it. If it's high tide, it'll bring a lot of salt water in. And if it's low tide, it'll be a lot fresher, or more fresh water. And I should say a lot of these systems, mangroves and salt marshes, are really good like nurseries for baby fish and other baby animals. Since a lot of things can't survive in there, these are great. They call them fish nurseries, basically. So they are really important for fish that will eventually be out in the ocean for their population development. Coral reefs. Coral reefs. I think most people are fairly familiar with coral reefs. You learn about them a lot because they're fascinating ecosystems. In high school, you probably heard about them. We don't have any close by. They're down, I guess the Caribbean's fairly close by here. But they generally occur in warm, shallow water. So they need light for photosynthesis, and they need pretty warm water, but not too warm. Warm, but not too warm. They are areas with a massive amount of biodiversity. So a lot of different species living in a fairly relatively small area. How many people have had biology 1102? What do you remember what coral is? Is it an animal, a plant? You guys learned that? It's an animal. It's an invertebrate animal. So a lot of people think of coral as like some kind of plant because these look like plants, right? So they are in the phylum Cnidaria. So coral is an animal. It's an invertebrate animal. Doesn't have a backbone, obviously. So Cnidaria, they are animals, and they are symbiotic with algae. So there's an algae that grows with them. The algae provides nutrition via photosynthesis. And then the animal, the coral animal, basically provides a structure for the algae to grow on. And another important aspect that's going to come up in a second, the skeleton. Does anyone remember what the skeleton of coral is made of? What do we have in our skeletons? Like what's calcium? So calcium carbonate, CaCO3. You guys can see that, sorry. CaCO3, calcium carbonate. That's what's underlying the body of the animal, basically. It's a skeleton. Technically not a skeleton because they're invertebrate, but they have calcium carbonate that provides their structure for them. And those two aspects, the fact that they, I should say algae, symbiotic algae as well. So symbiosis with algae. These two aspects are two areas where we are impacting coral reefs. So increasing ocean temps basically kill the algae. So algae killed by increasing ocean temperatures, killed by increasing temps. So as the oceans warm due to climate change, we're killing the algae, or that's killing the algae. That means the animals don't get the nutrition that they would normally get from the photosynthesis of the algae. And then the CaCO3 is affected as well. You guys remember, I mentioned ocean acidification briefly. Do you remember what causes ocean acidification? Like something dissolving into the water, a gas. Gas that dissolves into the oceans that we're spitting a bunch out of. Okay. Starts with a C. Carbon dioxide. Yeah. So carbon dioxide, basically you increase CO2, that's going to acidify the ocean. And you can look back at how that works. It basically creates carbonic acid in the ocean. And that breaks down CaCO3. So anything that has a lot of calcium, I mentioned like shelled organisms that have a lot of calcium carbonate in their shells, like mussels, oysters, lobsters. They're negatively affected, but because coral also have this calcium carbonate skeleton, they're negatively affected as well. So ocean acidification due to increased carbon dioxide is also killing off the coral reefs. So it's kind of a double whammy for what we're doing regarding climate change. It's increasing the ocean temps and increasing the acidity of the oceans. Questions about that? Hopefully that was clear. I don't know that my drawings are all that clear. Hopefully the explanation made sense. Okay. One last very quick slide. I haven't talked a lot about organisms in general, but in aquatic systems, these will come up again. So I want you to know sort of basically the base of the food web in aquatic systems is phytoplankton and zooplankton. Things that we can't even see, but they drive the productivity of aquatic ecosystems. Phytoplankton is, so plankton is something that's floating. You see that term, it just means floating, like in open water. Phyto refers to plants, so that's going to be our algae. Zoo refers to animals. So tiny little microscopic animals are zooplankton. Here we have phytoplankton, again, all microscopic. These are floating around and creating the food base for aquatic ecosystems. Macrophytes are just plants that you can see, macro meaning big. They're not tiny little algae, right? So macrophytes are really important in aquatic systems, and then have other animals. So the animals you typically think of in aquatic systems, fish, any insects, mammals that might be living there. I kind of just group them all together because they are obviously more noticeable to us. But these, especially these top two, are really what's driving the productivity and the functioning of aquatic ecosystems, the phytoplankton and the zooplankton. You'll see those terms again. I just want you to be familiar with them. Okay. That wraps up the biomes chapter. Do you guys have questions for me? No. I think I got rid of everything that I didn't cover. Okay, so we're going to move on. Let's take like a 2-minute break. If you need to get up, that's fine. Just take a break from listening to me talk, and then we'll reconvene in 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll get the next chapter uploaded. It should be on Canvas already.
I really wish I would have come to Starbucks.
Okay. Continuing on, this chapter is all about dealing with environmental variation. So I've talked about some characteristics. We've categorized different areas of the globe. Now I'm going to get into sort of some of the biotic responses, organisms' responses to specifically temperature and water. We've talked a lot about temperature and precipitation that drives the survival of a lot of species, so that's what we're focusing on here. We're going to talk about a few different aspects on this topic. First, individual organisms' responses to environmental variation. I'll touch on that first. So just kind of general, how organisms can respond. And then specifically, what plants and animals do in response to changes in temperature, and then changes in water. So we'll start with kind of a general overview of how species can respond to environmental changes. First off, all this comes down to stress. So survival comes down to how much stress is there in an environment. Stress is just anything that negatively affects an organism from a physiological point of view. So we're not talking about like mental stress, you know. We're imagining that animals and plants don't really, well, plants definitely don't have mental stress. We're talking physical here. So some kind of physical stressor. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Is there not enough water, etc.? This is what's ultimately going to affect the survival of the individual and then the survival of the population from a reproductive standpoint. Pretty much every organism has some kind of optimum environmental characteristic where their physiological processes are at their peak. So they aren't wasting a bunch of energy trying to stay warm. They are reproducing effectively. They're growing at a rapid rate. And if we just think of some environmental variable, you could think of this as temperature, low versus high. It's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. There are extreme organisms that do better maybe on one end of the spectrum versus the other, but pretty much everything has an optimum. Most organisms have to deal with some kind of stress. They're not living in the most ideal place all the time. So that's where they can, what we call acclimatize or acclimate or acclimatize. So in stressful situations, this is where organisms make short-term adjustments. So I underline short-term here. I'm going to talk about some longer-term adjustments they can make, but this is short-term. It could be a short-term change in their physiology, their morphology, their behavior in response to some kind of stress. So if we look at this lizard down here, this example on this graph, we have two lines. This would be the 33 degrees Celsius line. So when they're living at 33 degrees Celsius versus 16, so cold versus hot. Their oxygen consumption is going to change. So how much oxygen they're using, which basically affects their metabolism. If they're colder, they're using more oxygen than if they're warmer. And obviously this temperature can change pretty quickly, and they can change their oxygen consumption in relation to that quickly and over the short term. So not like evolutionary time scale, maybe within a day, nighttime, daytime, for example. So they'll change their oxygen consumption in response to that change in stress in reference to the temperature change. Over the long term, populations, so acclimation is short term, adaptation is long term. Over the long term, populations adapt. So an individual organism doesn't adapt, but a whole population will adapt to conditions so that whatever stress they're dealing with now becomes part of their norm. And they just survive in that, and that is now not stressful to them anymore. It's their normal. So an adaptation is a genetic change in the population. So this is much longer term. And it's usually in response to some kind of stress. Trade-offs are going to be a major theme in this class. There's always a trade-off. If you get a benefit in some area of living, you have to trade off somewhere else. So adaptation is going to involve some kind of trade-off. So a good example of this is that generally, as you move, say from the equator, warm areas to the poles, to cold areas, animals generally increase in body size. So they get bigger as you move towards the poles. So here we have an Arctic fox versus a desert fox. So here this guy lives in the desert, it's hot. This guy lives near the poles. Why do you think that matters? How is that going to help?
It helps preserve body heat.
Yeah, exactly. So it helps preserve body heat. It's surface area to volume ratio. You probably heard that a long, long time ago, or maybe pretty recently, but surface area to volume ratio is critical in so many aspects of biology and ecology. So surface area to volume. The more surface area you have, so that would be a good compared to the volume. He has a really a lot of surface area compared to how much volume he has inside of his body, right? He's going to release more heat that way because there's more surface area. This guy is protecting more of his insides with less surface area, more volume. So what could be a trade-off for this larger body size? Why would all organisms, obviously if they're in a hot area, they want to release heat, but what could be a trade-off for getting a bigger body size? What do they have to do?
Eat more.
They have to eat more, right? Very simply, they have to eat more, which can be difficult, say in polar regions in the winter, if there's not a lot of food to be found. So that's a good example of a trade-off. Yes, he can survive in much colder areas, but he has to eat a lot more to make that happen. So there's always a trade-off. It's not an all winning scenario ever in ecology. Species can basically do two different things when they have environmental variations to deal with. They can stay and tolerate it, or they can avoid it. So tolerance and avoidance are the two basic strategies that organisms will undertake to survive a stressful environmental condition. Tolerating it, like I said, means staying there and dealing with it. Avoidance is maybe leaving for another area. It can be behavioral. So if it's really hot during the day, organisms just aren't out during the day. So that's an avoidance behavior. Something that minimizes the damage. This brings us to the idea of geographic ranges. So I'm going to show you some range maps on the next few slides. So every species has a potential geographic distribution based on what it can tolerate. Potential and actual will oftentimes be different, and we'll talk about why that is. But potentially, if they can handle temperatures of, say, up to 95 degrees, they'll be in areas where, assuming there's enough precipitation, that are up to 95 degrees, but not beyond that. I think everyone has seen a range map at some point in their education. So range maps are potential distributions. So for these two different frogs, they can be found in all of these areas based on environmental conditions there. Doesn't mean they are, but they can be. It's potential. As I referred to, potential and actual distributions don't line up. The actual distribution is usually smaller than the potential. So here you can see a very simplified graph, abundance of organisms here, some kind of environmental gradient on the x-axis. Potentially, this species could inhabit all of this range of the gradient, or sorry, this range of the gradient. But really, they can only survive within these boundaries. So what are some reasons that these don't match up perfectly? Why can't they live absolutely everywhere based on environmental conditions, based on one environmental gradient, I should say? What keeps species from living somewhere where, say, the temperature would allow them to live? Humans, yeah. So competition, predation, so interactions with other organisms. Just because they can live somewhere doesn't mean that the organisms that are also living there will let them or let them be successful. So interactions with other organisms are a big reason. Food supply, yeah, so kind of from the bottom up. Is there food there? Maybe their food has a different geographic distribution. Excellent. And this is just showing one environmental gradient, right? So say this is temperature. Precipitation might also come into effect. So there's a lot of different environmental factors playing into where a species can live that may not be taken into account in like a simple graph like this. So species interactions, whether it's top down or kind of bottom up, food source or predation and competition, or the fact that there's a lot of different factors they have to deal with, not just one environmental factor. So even within the actual range, so this is a potential, this is the actual range, you still get changes in density. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. If you're looking for this species of bird, I don't know what it is. Anyone know birds? What? I'm going to tell Camp that you guys don't know this bird. A toady? Okay, good. A toady. So if you're looking for this bird out here in kind of the plains area, it's going to be a lot harder to find him compared to, say, down here in Georgia, right? The density is going to change based on how ideal the environment is. It's more ideal here for this bird than it is in maybe colder, slightly drier areas. So density changes even within the actual range. So you get a lot of variability. Okay, got like 9 more minutes. I'm going to continue on for a little bit. Moving on from this overview of how organisms can respond to environmental variation, we're going to move into specifically temperature. Temperature and water both important. Let's start with temp and why temperature matters. Limits on the high end of the temperature spectrum are mostly due to biochemical constraints. So it comes down to a pretty small scale. And specifically, enzymes. So enzymes that allow all of the metabolic reactions to happen in an organism are very temperature specific. If it's too hot or too cold, they won't work that well, and an organism's metabolism could shut down. So you can see here, this is just a generalized graph of how active an enzyme is at different temperatures. Every enzyme has an optimum. It doesn't mean they can't function at lower, or sometimes, especially higher temps, you see that really quick drop off. So it's a rapid drop off on the higher end. They'll denature very quickly if it's too hot. So they have this optimum temperature. Hopefully that's the temperature in which the organism lives, or its body temperature. On the other end of the spectrum, it's not so much based on enzyme activity, but in cold temperatures, all those lipids that make up the phospholipids that make up cell membranes, those can solidify. When you have solid cell membranes, things don't move in and out as efficiently, and the cell can totally shut down its functionality. Also, most organisms are mostly water. So why might this be a problem if you're, say, below freezing? What happens to the water in the body? It freezes. So you can imagine this liquid water freezing into basically these sharp shards, almost like glass of ice, inside cells. It'll rupture cells and it will kill cells and eventually kill the organism if the water in the body freezes. That is essentially what frostbite is. So if you've ever seen frostbite, those cells are dying because the water in the cells is freezing and rupturing the cell wall or the cell membranes and killing that tissue. I mentioned a few of these categories of how temperature can be gained or lost, or heat can be gained or lost. I wanted to revisit them to remind you of these temperature gains and losses, because this will come into effect when plants and animals are trying to control their temperature, oftentimes from behavioral or locational points of view. So first we have radiation. Energy can be gained or lost through radiation. Usually it's gained via the sun. That's our main source of radiative heat. So sun is going to increase temperature of whatever organism we're talking about. Conduction is physical contact between the surface, we'll say it's a warm surface, and the organism. So a lizard on the rock is a great example. If the rock's nice and warm and the lizard needs to warm up, it'll go lay on the rock and it'll gain heat through conduction. Convection is essentially wind. So this is where heat is transferred through liquids and gases. Wind can transfer heat really efficiently. If there's a lot of wind, it'll cool down animals, plants. If there's not a lot, it'll have the opposite effect, obviously. So convection, think wind. And then evaporation. So evaporation, we know takes heat away because it essentially turns liquid water into gaseous water, into water vapor, and takes that heat with it. So when we sweat, we are evaporating water out of us and losing that heat. Animals, plants do the same thing. With plants, it's evapotranspiration. And these concepts will come up in the next slide. Yeah. So I'm not going to get into this next slide, but these, we'll do this on Thursday. We're going to talk about temperature balance and how plants and animals both balance their temperatures using those 4 characteristics. And we'll have an equation, and you'll see all of these kind of coming into play again. So we'll talk about those on Thursday. And yeah, I'll see you then.